Pacific Ocean in the late 1930s was vast, silent, and seemingly endless. To the naked eye, it was only water stretching beyond the horizon. But beneath the calm surface, a hidden tension was building. Japan's empire had spread across Asia and the Pacific Islands, and its leaders relied on messages sent across thousands of miles to keep control of their fleets and armies. These transmissions, filled with coded numbers and strange symbols, carried orders that could decide the fate of entire campaigns. For the Japanese command, the codes wrapped their secrets in a protective shield, allowing them to speak freely even in the midst of war. To them, the ocean was a wall, and their language of numbers was the lock. Yet across the Pacific, America was listening. In quiet offices in Washington, D.C., and at secret facilities near Pearl Harbor, teams of cryptologists collected every signal they could catch from the airwaves. Imagine the sound of a faint signal tapping through the static of a radio set late at night, a distant voice carried by invisible waves across thousands of miles. To most ears, it was meaningless noise, but to these men and women, it was a challenge, a puzzle that promised insight into an enemy's plans. Each intercepted message was written down, logged and filed, waiting for the day it would reveal its secrets. The United States knew that Japan's ambitions were growing, and that secrecy was the empire's most powerful shield. The messages flying through the air were not just words, but weapons, able to guide ships, direct armies, and set traps for the unwary. The Japanese trusted these codes completely, confident in their complexity. What they did not realize was that the very act of speaking so freely would become their undoing. With each transmission, they left behind breadcrumbs, and patient minds in America were determined to follow the trail. This early context sets the stage for one of the most remarkable hidden battles of the Second World War. It was not fought with guns, tanks, or planes, but with radios, pencils, and notebooks. It was fought by people who never set foot on a battlefield, yet whose victories would echo in the roar of cannons and the crash of bombs. In the silence of cramped rooms filled with the hum of machines, America began to chip away at the wall of secrecy Japan had built. The war for signals had already begun, long before the first major clashes in the Pacific. What made this hidden war so remarkable was its invisibility to the outside world. A sailor on the deck of a battleship would never know that his survival might depend on a code broken thousands of miles away. A pilot diving into combat would never see the cryptologist who made sure he was in the right place at the right time. To those on the front lines, victories and losses seemed to come from luck, bravery, or sheer willpower. In truth, many of those moments were decided long before the first shot was fired, in the quiet spaces where intercepted signals whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. The Pacific in those early years was a stage where two dramas unfolded at once. On the surface, there were the movements of fleets, the seizure of islands, and the sound of marching soldiers. Beneath the surface, invisible but just as real, was the steady battle of codes and cryptanalysis. This dual struggle would shape the course of the war. It would make victories possible that once seemed impossible, and it would turn what looked like chance into calculated triumphs. As the tension mounted and the world edged closer to open conflict, the stage was set for America's quiet war to become one of its greatest strengths. The secret struggle between America and Japan was built on a striking difference in perspective. To the Japanese command, their cryptographic systems were walls of iron. They believed their codes were too complex for any outsider to penetrate, too elaborate for any foreigner to understand. Generals and admirals transmitted orders across the Pacific with the certainty that their enemies were blind to their plans. This confidence, almost bordering on arrogance, would prove to be a fatal flaw. On the American side, the mood could not have been more different. Every intercepted message was seen as a potential key, every string of numbers as a puzzle waiting to be solved. The Americans never assumed that a code was unbreakable. Instead, they treated every obstacle as temporary, something that could be overcome with patience and persistence. The contrast was stark. Japan trusted its secrecy without question, while the United States questioned secrecy at every turn. Imagine the daily grind of the codebreakers. The rooms were filled with stacks of intercepted messages, their pages covered in seemingly random groups of numbers and symbols. To the untrained eye, it was gibberish, but to the cryptologists, it was a living opponent, stubborn yet vulnerable. They knew that somewhere in the patterns lay a crack, a weakness that could be widened with enough effort. Where Japan saw security, America saw opportunity. It was not a clash of armies, but of mindsets. The Japanese high command could not conceive of their codes being broken because their own culture of secrecy was absolute. Officers were taught from the beginning to place trust in silence, in controlled information, and in the belief that outsiders could never understand their systems. This trust became complacency, and complacency became danger. The Americans, on the other hand, thrived on doubt. Their suspicion kept them working late into the night, hunting for flaws that their adversaries were certain did not exist. As the two sides grew further apart in their assumptions, the gap in advantage widened. Japanese signals continued to flow freely through the air, carrying vital information across vast distances. The Americans caught them, stored them, and dissected them piece by piece. What Japan believed to be invisible had in reality become a trail of clues. The clash of belief and doubt shaped the silent battlefield of cryptography just as surely as any clash of ships at sea. The true conflict here was not between machines or even between codes. It was a conflict of confidence against skepticism, of assumption against relentless questioning. Japan's certainty blinded it to the possibility of danger, while America's unease pushed it to uncover truths hidden in the static. This difference, subtle but powerful, would tip the balance of the war long before either side fully understood what was happening. What looked like invisible signals drifting harmlessly across the Pacific were in fact weapons, and in the battle to control them, doubt proved stronger than faith. Long before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, a quiet war had already begun. In the 1930s, as Japan expanded across Asia, the United States Navy took notice of the empire's growing ambitions. Commanders in Washington recognized that any future war in the Pacific would hinge on communication. Fleets spread across thousands of miles could only function if their orders were transmitted clearly and securely. So the Americans began listening. Small groups of naval officers and linguists were tasked with intercepting Japanese signals, studying them with patience, and building the first foundations of what would later become a full-scale, code-breaking campaign. The work was far from glamorous. Imagine a small office filled with the constant hum of radio receivers, papers stacked in tall piles, and exhausted officers scribbling down endless strings of numbers. These early intercepts often seemed meaningless, but they carried the seeds of knowledge. Slowly, the cryptologists began to recognize patterns. A certain symbol might reappear in the same place, or a sequence of numbers might repeat itself after weeks. Each small discovery was carefully logged, and each note brought them a step closer to piercing the Japanese veil of secrecy. In these early years, the American effort was built less on machines and more on sheer human perseverance. The cryptologists relied on notebooks, pencils, and sharp minds. They drew from mathematics, linguistics, and intuition, combining skills in ways no single discipline could match. A linguist might notice how Japanese sentence structures shaped the code, while a mathematician might spot the rhythm of repeating numbers. Together, they worked like craftsmen, slowly carving out understanding from a block of obscurity. As tensions between the two nations grew, the urgency of this hidden labor increased. Every intercepted message felt heavier with meaning, as if the future of the Pacific depended on unlocking its secrets. For the cryptologists, this was not a mere intellectual exercise. It was a race against time. They could sense war was coming, and when it did, the ability to read the enemy's signals might mean the difference between survival and disaster. By the eve of Pearl Harbor, the groundwork had been laid. American cryptologists had not yet unlocked every Japanese code, but they had built the skills and systems needed to expand their efforts on a much larger scale. The knowledge gained in the 1930s provided them with tools that would soon prove invaluable. What began as a small effort, tucked away in quiet offices, had transformed into a mission of national importance. The Japanese believed they spoke in silence, but already, American ears were straining to catch every word. The origins of this secret war reveal the patience and persistence required to prepare for the unseen. It was not sudden brilliance that gave America its edge, but years of steady effort, often unnoticed and unrewarded. These early pioneers could not have imagined the scale of the conflict to come, but their work ensured that when the time arrived, the United States would not be blind. They had laid the first stones of a bridge that would eventually carry the Allies across the Pacific, one message at a time. When the Pacific War erupted in full force, the quiet work of the cryptologists suddenly revealed its true value. Every decoded signal became a fragment of a larger picture, guiding commanders who otherwise would have been forced to fight blind. Imagine a fleet commander in the middle of the vast ocean, faced with the impossible task of predicting where the enemy might strike. Thanks to the deciphered transmissions, those guesses turned into informed decisions. The invisible war in the code rooms began to shape the visible war on the waves. One of the most striking effects was the ability to anticipate Japanese fleet movements. Messages that seemed ordinary at first glance often contained orders that revealed the timing and direction of operations. For the Americans, knowing when and where the enemy planned to move was like holding a lantern in a dark forest. It meant they could position their ships and aircraft in the right place at the right time, turning uncertainty into opportunity. What seemed like coincidence on the battlefield was, in truth, the result of unseen foresight. To the men on the ground, the victories that followed often felt like strokes of luck. A platoon would find itself waiting in ambush at precisely the moment the enemy appeared. Or a squadron of planes would catch Japanese bombers unaware in the sky. Soldiers, sailors, and pilots rarely knew that the rhythm of their battles had been set by someone far away, hunched over intercepted codes in dimly lit rooms. The battlefield was a stage, and behind the curtain, the cryptologists were quietly pulling the strings. For the Japanese, the results were baffling. Again and again, their forces stumbled into situations where the enemy seemed to know their plans before they had even acted. A fleet that believed itself hidden suddenly faced American carriers. A convoy that thought it was safe was met with relentless attack. The Japanese officers suspected chance, or perhaps even betrayal, but they never considered that their coded words were being read by the very enemies they sought to deceive. Their confidence in secrecy left them exposed to repeated shocks. This cryptographic advantage did not erase the dangers of combat, but it tilted the scales in America's favor. The Pacific was a brutal theater where every mistake could cost thousands of lives. Yet the Americans often seemed to arrive with uncanny precision, striking where their blows would matter most. Each success boosted morale and reinforced the belief that victory was possible, even against an enemy that had seemed unstoppable in the early months of war. It was as if fortune itself had joined their side, when in truth it was the work of tireless minds cracking codes. In this way, the impact of code breaking was felt most sharply, not in the quiet offices where it happened, but in the chaos of battle. The roar of gunfire, the crash of bombs, and the shouts of men in combat were all shaped, in part, by the silent triumphs of the cryptologists. Every decoded signal that found its way into a commander's hands saved lives and altered the course of campaigns. In a war defined by vast distances and endless uncertainty, the ability to see the enemy's hand in advance proved to be a decisive weapon. The ability to read Japanese signals rippled outward from the code rooms into every corner of the Pacific war effort. It did not only provide tactical advantages in battles, but also reshaped the very way Allied commanders thought about strategy. Instead of reacting to enemy moves, they could anticipate them, plan accordingly, and turn the initiative in their favor. This shift in approach was transformative. It gave American leaders confidence in their decisions, while their Japanese counterparts often found themselves forced to improvise in confusion. The battlefield became a stage where one side acted with foresight, while the other stumbled in the dark. The effect was not confined to headquarters or command posts. The morale of American forces was directly influenced by the steady string of victories that seemed almost miraculous. Soldiers and sailors who had once feared the unstoppable momentum of Japanese expansion began to believe in their own strength. Each success built a sense of trust in the chain of command, a feeling that the men at the top knew what they were doing. While the troops did not know the full story, they felt its impact. Confidence spread like wildfire, reinforcing the belief that the tide of war could turn in their favor. For Japan, the consequences were devastating in ways they could not fully understand. They continued to send orders across the Pacific, confident in the strength of their codes. Yet every transmission carried with it the seeds of failure, because each one gave the Americans another clue. Entire operations were compromised without a single shot being fired. Japanese officers grew puzzled by how often their plans fell apart, but their faith in the invulnerability of their communications blinded them to the truth. In this way, secrecy became their greatest weakness. Imagine the frustration of Japanese commanders who carefully arranged a fleet movement or a supply convoy, only to find it ambushed at exactly the wrong time. To them, it might have looked like coincidence or a stroke of enemy luck, but in reality, it was the result of a quiet betrayal by the airwaves themselves. Their own voices, carried across radio signals, betrayed their intentions to their opponents. The wider war was shaped by this invisible leakage of information, slowly eroding the empire's ability to sustain its campaigns. The Americans, meanwhile, discovered that intelligence from codebreaking could serve as more than just a tool for battles. It allowed them to make broader strategic choices with greater precision. They could allocate resources where they mattered most, avoid unnecessary risks, and conserve their strength for decisive moments. The war in the Pacific was vast, stretching across oceans and islands, and such foresight was invaluable. The hidden information gained from signals gave the Allies the ability to wage war with sharper focus and fewer missteps. Ultimately, the wider consequences of this secret advantage extended beyond the battlefield. It altered the psychology of the war itself. For the Americans, the sense of control and foresight brought resilience and determination. For the Japanese, the repeated surprises brought doubt and fear. Wars are not fought by weapons alone, but also by morale. And in that invisible realm, the codebreakers played as crucial a role as any general or admiral. Their work shifted the balance not only of strategy, but of spirit, helping to turn the Pacific from a Japanese stronghold into contested waters where Allied confidence steadily grew. As the Pacific War reached its height, the power of codebreaking stood out in ways that could no longer be denied. By this stage, American commanders were not simply hoping to catch the enemy off guard. They were making calculated choices, based on the knowledge that Japanese signals had already laid their secrets bare. Imagine a vast ocean where every move seemed unpredictable, yet one side suddenly held a map showing the enemy's path. That was the advantage the codebreakers had created. What looked like bold gambles to the outside world were, in truth, carefully informed decisions. The Japanese continued to trust in their systems, sending out orders with complete faith in their security. They could not see the cracks that had already spread through their walls of secrecy. Each time a message was intercepted and decoded, their advantage slipped further away. Still, they moved with the certainty of commanders who believed their words were untouchable. This confidence became their undoing. They marched straight into battles where the Americans were waiting for them, as if guided by an unseen hand. For the United States, the climax of this hidden struggle meant something more than just victory in individual encounters. It meant the ability to dictate the rhythm of the war itself. American fleets no longer sailed blindly into danger, but instead sought out the enemy with precision. Campaigns that might have ended in disaster became decisive blows against Japanese forces. The war was still costly, but the silent guidance of decoded signals gave the Allies the ability to fight with an edge that their opponents never understood. On the battlefield, the results were unmistakable. Fleets clashed in seemingly sudden confrontations, where the Americans appeared to be in the perfect position every time. Pilots flew missions that struck enemy forces at their weakest points. Soldiers advanced with confidence, often unaware that their movements were supported by intelligence gathered from rooms filled with radios and paper. What appeared to be fortune was, in fact, foresight. The silent victories of the codebreakers echoed in the noise of guns and the crash of bombs. For Japanese officers, the experience was bewildering. Again and again, their plans unraveled in ways that could not be explained. Convoys that should have been safe were destroyed. Operations that promised surprise turned into ambushes. Suspicion grew within their ranks. But the thought that their codes had been broken seemed too improbable to consider. Their disbelief allowed the Americans to continue exploiting their weakness, building momentum at a critical moment in the war. The climax of this struggle was not marked by a single event, but by a series of turning points where the hidden advantage proved decisive. It was a gradual tightening of the noose, each decoded message drawing the Japanese closer to defeat. The Americans pressed forward with growing certainty, while their enemies fought with dwindling confidence. The silent war of signals had reached its most powerful moment, shaping the outcome of the Pacific Campaign as surely as any battle fought with weapons. In the clash of faith and doubt, it was doubt that triumphed, and with it came a path toward victory. When the war finally drew to a close in 1945, the story of America's cryptographic triumph remained hidden in silence. The soldiers and sailors who returned home were celebrated for their courage, their sacrifices, and their victories in battle. Yet few knew that behind those triumphs stood another group of unsung heroes, men and women who had fought the war without firing a single shot. Their offices had been their battlefields, their pencils and papers their weapons. They had listened to the whispers of the enemy, broken their codes, and handed the keys of victory to those on the front lines. For years, the full scope of their work was kept secret, locked away in classified archives. The public saw only the surface. The explosions, the battles, the dramatic turning points. The codebreakers themselves rarely spoke of their role, bound by duty and the quiet pride of knowing that their labor had saved countless lives. Imagine the strange mixture of pride and frustration, carrying the knowledge that victories attributed to luck or bravery were in truth the result of hours spent in silent, tireless work. Their contribution was invisible, but its weight could not be denied. The impact of reading Japanese signals went far beyond winning battles. It shortened the war, prevented disasters, and saved untold numbers of lives on both sides. Every campaign that ended sooner, every ambush that was avoided, meant fewer soldiers lost and fewer civilians caught in the crossfire. The ability to unlock the secrets of the enemy transformed the course of the conflict, turning what might have been a long and drawn-out struggle into a war that could be ended more decisively. The legacy of this achievement was not just in the past, but in the lives it preserved for the future. In the decades that followed, historians began to uncover the truth, piecing together the hidden story of the codebreakers. What emerged was not simply a tale of cryptography, but a reminder of the power of intellect and persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. Wars are often remembered for their weapons and battles, yet the struggle to understand and outthink the enemy proved just as decisive. The story of America's silent war revealed that knowledge itself can be a weapon, one that strikes without sound, but leaves a profound mark on history. Today, the legacy of this hidden struggle endures. It serves as a testament to the quiet determination of those who worked in shadows, reminding us that courage is not always found on the battlefield. Sometimes it lies in the patience to face an impossible puzzle, in the discipline to search for answers through endless nights, and in the vision to see that wars can be won not only with strength, but with understanding. The codebreakers of World War II left behind a legacy of intellect, perseverance, and sacrifice. Their story remains one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of the Pacific War, a silent victory that continues to echo through time.